Hey there, sleepless rabble. Sometimes a story catches fire in a way nobody expects. It starts small, a gift, a rumor, a strange little object, and then suddenly the whole world is whispering about it, adding layers until myth and memory blur into one. This is one of those stories. A doll that looks ordinary but carries decades of fear, fascination, and speculation. Some say she's dangerous, others laugh it off, but either way, she became a symbol that refuses to fade. So, wherever you are, winding down, stuck on the train, or just looking for a distraction from reality, let me take over for a while. We'll untangle how a single object turned into a cultural legend, and why people still argue about what's real and what's rumor. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the strange and uncanny, you know what to do. Subscribe, drop a like, and maybe send a little support at kofi.com/napmax. Now, let's begin. You expect legends to kick off with thunder, with doors slamming and lights exploding in showers of sparks. Mostly, they start with something awkwardly ordinary. A key turning in a cheap lock, new textbooks stacked on a wobbly table, a mother handing over a gift that makes sense to her heart and almost none to anyone else. Hartford, 1970. A small apartment with thin walls and a radiator that hissed like it had opinions. Donna, a nursing student moving in with more optimism than furniture. The present from home arrived wrapped in paper that used to smell like a department store, now flattened and tired from the bus ride. Inside, a Raggedy Ann. Cloth body, button eyes stitched into permanent surprise. Yarn hair, the red of a child's crayon pressed too hard. It looked like comfort, like childhood, if you ignored the way those stitched pupils seemed to stare even in the dim. At first, the doll did what dolls do best. Nothing. It slouched on the couch, sagged into a corner of the bed, occupied space the way a memory does, quietly, persistently. Donna's roommate, Angie, pretended not to find it strange. Adults and dolls, it's a combination that can feel whimsical or a little off, depending on how much sleep you've had and how honest you're willing to be about the gravity of objects. They dusted around it. They made jokes. They named it because, of course, you name a face that keeps showing up in the room. Annabelle. The sound of the name was soft and old-fashioned, like Sunday dresses and lemonade. Small things came first. The doll's arm tilted differently than Donna remembered leaving it. One foot seemed turned toward the hallway, when both had pointed toward the window. A head cocked slightly, as if listening. It's the kind of detail you let slide on a busy morning. You blame your memory. You blame your roommate. You blame the way time gets rubbery when you're doing shift work. And your notes for pharmacology are starting to look like alien code. Except, it kept happening. Donna would leave Annabelle on the sofa before class and find her on the bed after. Not dramatically posed, not theatrical. Just wrong enough to tap the back of the mind and whisper, "Are you sure?" Angie swore she hadn't moved it. Donna said the same. Friends visited, and you could watch the moment the doll entered their peripheral vision like a draft. People laughed a little too loud. Someone suggested it was funny. A mascot. A talisman for luck during exams. No one offered to take it home. Then the notes arrived. Little scraps of paper in a hand that looked like a child learning to write. Uneven letters, hesitant lines, an extra loop where none belonged. Help us. That was the first one. Then, help Lou. Lou, the friend who dropped by to fix squeaky doors and open stubborn jars, and talk Donna and Angie through the thin places between midnight and morning. The messages were short, and the problem wasn't only what they said, it was where they came from. There weren't pads like that in the apartment. The pencil marks didn't match the graphite they kept in the drawer with elastics and stray coins. The texture of the paper was unfamiliar. The notes felt less like something someone had written and more like something that had arrived. This is where people pull out rational explanations like talismans of their own. Someone's playing a prank. Someone's sleepwalking. Someone's memory is bad. These are all reasonable, and reasonable comforts us. But the notes kept coming, and the doll kept shifting, and the air in the apartment began to feel charged. Like the moment before lightning decides where to land. Lou didn't like the doll. He said so in the irritated way you talk about a song that gets stuck in your head, even though you hate it. It's creepy, he said, which is the least analytical way to describe something that feels wrong and also the most honest. One night, he fell asleep on the couch, a textbook sliding off his chest. The kind of nap you take, not because you want to, but because your body throws a blanket over you and says, enough. He swore he woke to a weight on his chest, heavy, deliberate, pressing the air out of him. He tried to move and couldn't. Sleep paralysis is a thing. Medical students will confirm it for you with diagrams and serotonin pathways. But when he finally hauled himself upright, blinking the room back into focus, there were scratches across his torso. Long, shallow, 3 at a time. They faded quickly, which almost made it worse. A threat withdrawn is still a threat. The apartment began to develop a personality. Knocks came from inside walls with no reason to carry sound. The kitchen clock lost minutes that no one could find again. Donna came home once to discover the doll kneeling on a chair. Kneeling as if in prayer, as if someone's hands had carefully bent the soft joints and balanced the cloth body. Cloth dolls do not kneel, they slump. If they kneel, you're either dealing with a dedicated prankster or the sort of house guest you can't evict with a landlord's letter. Fear has a way of reorganizing the furniture in your mind. They brought in a medium, not the kind with theatrics and velvet capes, but a woman who looked like your librarian and spoke like a nurse. She sat with the doll. She listened to the apartment like it was telling her a story between the lines. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with a flourish. She said a name, Annabelle Higgins. A little girl, she explained, who had died on or near the property, lonely, interested in the kindness of the 2 young women who lived where she had once played. Not malicious, just present, seeking permission to stay. If you've ever worked with spirit, you know that permission is a hinge. Consent opens and closes more than doors. Donna and Angie felt the room ease when they said yes. They weren't foolish, they were compassionate. The idea of a child spirit finally finding warmth in a place that had gone cold, that lands in a very human spot. Skeptics will scoff, believers will nod. Either way, the choice changed the atmosphere. The notes paused. The movements grew less theatrical, more domestic. The doll seemed to prefer the bedroom now, as if she'd chosen a corner to own. Sometimes compassion is enough. Sometimes compassion opens the window and something else walks in on the breeze. Lou, predictably, didn't relax. He watched the doll the way a cat watches a door. He joked less. He checked on the women more often, which was sweet until it started to feel like he was guarding a threshold. He argued with air. Don't invite what you can't send away, he told them. The advice came out gruff, but there was affection at its root. Fear often masquerades as anger because anger feels like control. Nights wore down into thin silk. Donna would drift and jolt, the way you do when you're half listening for a sound you can't name. A drawer would be open in the morning that she was sure she'd closed. The doll would sit too close to the door, as if expecting someone. Shadows in the hallway lengthened even at noon. That's the tricky thing about houses. The light inside can learn your habits and echo them back. And then you're not sure whether it's you or something else at work. Eventually, enough is enough. The apartment may be yours, but peace is rented month to month. They reached out for help beyond a private sitting. The call went to a priest because in 1970, that is what a lot of people did when their lives became a little unexplainable around the edges. He listened. He did not mock. He suggested they speak to a couple who had made a life's work out of stepping into rooms like this and telling the difference between grief, noise, and something inhuman wearing a human face. Names were given. Arrangements were made. The doll sat very still that week, which somehow felt worse than when she moved. It's unsettling when the thing that has been misbehaving decides to behave perfectly, like a child gone quiet in the next room. Silence isn't always peace, sometimes it's preparation. If the story had ended there, with a medium's reassurance, a priest's blessing, the doll retired to a shelf, it would have been a local tale traded over coffee and never leaving Hartford. But stories go looking for stages big enough to hold them. The door buzzed. Footsteps came down the hall. 2 people stepped into that small apartment and looked at the doll like it was a puzzle they'd met before under different names. And that is when a private haunting became a public narrative. When a soft body with button eyes was promoted, no fault of her own, to the role of cultural lightning rod. The apartment exhaled. The radiator hissed. Somewhere down the block, a car radio crackled with summer. Inside, introductions were made, and the language in the room shifted from maybe to categories with weight. Human, inhuman, invited, bound, contained. Whatever would happen next would not be quiet. Whatever would be said about it would travel far. And the glass case waiting miles away, in a museum that wasn't yet a museum, felt the future close like a lid. They arrived like weather fronts, not loudly, but with the sense that the pressure in the room had changed. Ed with that practical, blue-collar steadiness, broad hands, a face that said he'd spent more time in basements and attics than any man should. And Lorraine with eyes that seemed to catch light from the edges, like there was always a reflection you weren't seeing directly. They didn't treat Donna and Angie like hysterics. They didn't treat the doll like a joke. They treated the apartment like a patient. The introductions were small talk stitched to watchfulness. Names, a quick timeline, the notes retrieved from a drawer that suddenly felt like evidence. Lorraine sat not with the doll, but near it. Angled like you would toward a skittish animal you didn't want to spook. Ed moved around the space slowly, registering thresholds, corners, the kind of nooks where an argument in the air might choose to linger. They asked questions without pushing. When did it start? How often? Has anything followed you outside the apartment? Any smells? Sweet, sour, metallic? Any dreams that aren't yours? There's a tone some people adopt around hauntings. Grand, theatrical, a little intoxicated with their own spook. The Warrens did not use that tone. Their gravity came from repetition. They'd seen this pattern before, mapped it in pencil on 100 kitchens, felt it in 100 hallways where the temperature dropped for no reason. Ed spoke of stages the way an EMT speaks of shock. Infestation, oppression, possession. Progressions, not headlines. The implication was simple and not soothing. What you invite isn't always what arrives, and what arrives doesn't always introduce itself honestly. Lorraine looked at the notes as if they were postcards from a place with a different weather system. Help us, and help Lou. She asked Donna to hold the doll, not because the object demanded it, but because a relationship had already been formed and it is unkind to edit a relationship out of the room. Then she spoke in that careful way people do when they're trying to say only what they know. It feels borrowed, not a child, something wearing a story like a ribbon. The word they used wasn't ghost. It was in human spirit. Something that doesn't belong to human time frames or human hungers, yet understands them well enough to mimic. Not a little girl at the edge of a playground. Something older than that idea. Using it like camouflage. If you're the type to scoff, fine. If you're the type to nod, you already know what came next. Boundaries, naming. Securing the perimeter of a life so it doesn't collapse under the weight of an unseen guest. They prayed. Not in Latin thunder or cinema baritone, but in the plain, stubborn cadence of people who believe words can build fences. Ed moved with a ritual's muscle memory. Holy water at thresholds, a cross traced lightly like a seam being reinforced. Lorraine's part was quieter. Attention. The kind that feels like listening with the whole body. The apartment, prickled and tense for weeks, exhaled by degrees. Not perfectly. Not like a switch flipped. But the way a shaken animal stops trembling in stages. First the shoulders, then the back legs. It would be convenient if that were the end. If you could say a prayer and took the world back in its drawer. But boundaries sometimes irritate what they restrain. The following nights were less dramatic, more insistent. Knocks at odd hours, the kind that come as pairs, as if something is practicing manners. A shape at the edge of a mirror where no one was standing. And always the doll, patient as weather, appearing where it was not left, angled toward the door like a commuter waiting for a bus that never came. The Warrens made a recommendation that sounded both humble and severe. The apartment could be blessed, yes. The women could reclaim the space, yes. But the object at the center of the narrative should be removed. Not destroyed. This wasn't a bonfire fairy tale, and besides, destruction isn't always closure. Contained, isolated, placed somewhere where its radius would not graze ordinary nights. So the doll left. Not with drama, there was no cinematic moment of the head turning as it crossed the threshold, but with the quiet resignation of a portrait taken down from a wall. Ed tucked her into the back seat with the care you reserve for fragile things, even when you don't like them. On the drive, the car stuttered once, twice, as if the road had hit a pocket of air. Lorraine watched the rearview mirror as if it spoke a language. Some people will tell you the car tried to die 3 times, and only a prayer kept the engine awake. Others will say it's a story polished by miles. Either way, the doll rode out of Hartford, and the apartment felt like a chest after a coughing fit. Raw, but capable of breath again. You know the next part because it became a photograph. The glass case, the little wooden cabinet, the sign with its schoolteacher sternness. Positively do not open. A phrase that works as instruction, warning, and dare. The case looked homemade, which made it worse, like a coffin built by someone who cared too much and not enough. Monitors of one kind or another. Relics around it like a congregation. A museum, eventually, though at first it was a private collection with a public temperament. People would come. People would stare. People would read the sign and feel the itch in their fingers that only forbidden doors can raise. This was not cynicism. The Warrens didn't traffic in wink-wink legend for the sake of it. They believed what they were doing mattered. They believed certain objects were not merely props, but points of contact. Like a lightning rod is not merely a stick, but a root. The case was a gate, shut and latched. The sign was the latch's second cousin, a social hinge to keep the curious from unlearning caution. If you've ever worked a threshold, you understand. Most of the job is carpentry, the rest is grammar. Stories gathered anyway. A priest, young and newly bold, tapped the glass and joked with the confidence of a man whose life has not yet tested the tensile strength of his jokes. The ride home cost him. So the legend goes. Squealing tires, a near miss, a fear that stuck to his ribs. A visitor jeered and left on a motorcycle. The road reminded him his body was breakable. Are these reports neat? Factual? Notarized? Number. They are oral tradition wearing leather jackets. But here's the thing about folklore. It is a barometer of how a community feels about a subject. Around Annabelle, the needle never settled at fair weather. Books arrived, lecture circuits, newspaper features with photographs that tried very hard to make a soft doll look like a fang. Ed's toolbox of case files grew heavier. Lorraine's sobriety about rooms that hold more than furniture cut through the noise. The doll did nothing the public could measure. The stories around her did all the moving. That's a kind of haunting too. The way narrative can clothe a quiet object in louder meanings until you can't tell whether you're responding to the thing or to the coat it wears. If you're keeping track of the human heart in all this, note how the women who first lived with the doll did their best not to feed the theatre. They wanted ordinary nights back. They wanted to pass exams, to sleep, to wake without checking a chair. The Warrens, for all the spectacle history has grafted onto them, were medics of a sort. They triaged. They stabilized. They moved the patient. After that, the cultural bloodstream did what it does. It carried the story to places strangers could touch it with their eyes. Time passed. The case settled into its role as furniture no one dusts casually. The sign became part of the rhythm of the room, like an exhale between curious footsteps. The museum, official in some years, contested in others, grew into a pilgrimage for people who wanted to stand a breath away from the idea of danger without having to walk home with it. Some came to scoff and left a shade quieter. Some came to pray and left with the steadying relief that someone had put the tiger behind glass. And yet, even glass can't keep a story still. Photographs leaked, blurred, refocused, television circled, dramatized, cut to commercial. A film franchise chose porcelain for cheekbones and carved menace into the face because menace photographs better than a soft grin. The real doll, button-eyed and mild, sat under fluorescent lights and didn't argue with any of it. She didn't have to. The point of a symbol is that it allows everyone to hang their coat on it. Fear, belief, mockery, faith, and the coat rack remains. By the time the internet found her with its megaphone, the groundwork had been poured. The case was fixed. The sign had become a meme, reproduced in t-shirts and grainy posts. The warnings had ripened into folklore that could be summed up in a caption. The museum's hours became less certain. The legend's hours became 24/7. And in rooms far from Connecticut, people scrolled late at night and felt that familiar twinge at the spine, the one that insists something might be looking back at you, even if it's only pixels. If you're looking for blame, you won't find it here. This isn't a courtroom, it's a map. Two women tried to live with a kindness that maybe wasn't met by kindness. Two investigators did what they knew to keep the edges from fraying. A doll sat, a case closed. A culture opened its mouth and exhaled a story so wide it could be heard 3 states away. The next part doesn't unfold in a quiet Connecticut room. It moves against instinct out into the world. Hotel ballrooms, theaters, curated nights where the object is brought closer to the people who made her famous without ever lifting the latch. You can call it dangerous, you can call it educational, you can call it performance or pilgrimage. Whatever name you use, the current was strong. And like any object sitting perfectly still at the eye of a storm, she drew things toward her. Curiosity, faith, bravado, grief, until the radius widened enough to include a new cast and a darker headline. You would think a glass case would be the end of it. An object contained, the problem filed away like paperwork stamped closed. But stories don't like to stay in boxes, and neither do the things people decide are cursed. The Warren Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut was never the Smithsonian, but it carried the same gravity for those who believed. Walk its narrow aisles and you'd see relics with more backstory than sparkle. Mirrors said to whisper back, a satanic idol pulled from a barn, a wedding dress that apparently danced by itself when no one was looking. And then, in the back corner, there she sat. Annabelle. A doll that looked like your grandmother's attic had sneezed it out. Button eyes, yarn hair, the kind of smile you'd find printed on a lunchbox in the 1950s. Her cabinet was homemade, not the sleek, bulletproof Hollywood version. A wooden case, glass front, cross nailed to the top like an afterthought, and that infamous sign, positively, do not open. It looked like something you'd find in a church basement. Humble, faintly awkward, and somehow more frightening for it. Because the danger isn't in polish, it's in sincerity. People came and they came with expectations. Some crossed themselves before the case, whispering prayers as if the air around it were thinner. Some smirked, knocked the glass, muttered, "Really? This thing?" As though defiance might shield them. Folklore blossomed around those moments. The cocky priest who dismissed Annabelle as superstition and nearly died in a car accident on his drive home. The biker who jeered, "You can't hurt me," then sped away on his motorcycle and, so the story goes, never made it to his destination. Were these tales written up in police reports, complete with names and timestamps? Number, but retellings never ask for evidence. They ask for impact. And impact is what people remembered. By the late 1990s, the museum itself had grown contentious. Neighbors complained, insurance companies frowned. Eventually it closed to the public, though the legend was already far too big to lock behind a door. Paranormal tours, lectures, television appearances. Annabelle left her case not physically, but culturally, showing up in living rooms, through documentaries and talk shows. And then Hollywood came calling. When The Conjuring premiered in 2013, it wasn't just a horror film. It was the rebirth of a franchise that turned the Warrens into household names, and Annabelle into a blockbuster celebrity. The porcelain-faced nightmare that James Wan's camera adored looked nothing like the real doll, but that didn't matter. Fear is about aesthetics, and porcelain cracks prettier than cloth. On screen, she dripped menace, lurked in shadows, practically purred with malevolence. The real Annabelle just sat there, mute, stuffed, unimpressed. But the audience didn't care. They screamed, they bought tickets, they told friends. The irony? The films amplified the myth, and the myth doubled back on the real doll. People visited Monroe convinced the Hollywood version had been sanitized, that the truth was darker than the movies, that the real Annabelle could, at any moment, stand up and press her cloth hands against the glass. The narrative became self-feeding. The more unbelievable the story, the more people believed it. By 2020, the internet gave her another lease on life. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. Suddenly, Annabelle was everywhere. Rumors exploded one August morning. Annabelle escaped from her case. Screenshots spread. A screenshot of a mistranslated article about an actress named Annabelle Wallace turned into viral hysteria. Within hours, hashtags trended worldwide. People joked about locking their bedroom doors. Others swore they felt a presence. Nessipur, the Warren Family Foundation, had to post official reassurances that the doll was still in her case, still as motionless as ever. But the damage, or the magic, was done. Annabelle was now part of the digital bloodstream. A meme. A panic button. Proof that folklore doesn't die. It rebrands. And that brings us to the most recent chapter. Because for decades, Annabelle stayed put. A stationary attraction in a quiet Connecticut town. But in 2025, things changed. She went on the road. Devils on the Run. That's what they called it. A traveling paranormal exhibit featuring haunted objects, led by the New England Society for Psychic Research. For the first time, the famous doll wasn't just an image on a screen or a shadow behind glass in Monroe. She was in hotel ballrooms, theaters, moving state to state in a cabinet like some unholy roadshow. People lined up to see her, phones in hand, eyes wide with that strange cocktail of dread and thrill. And at the center of it was Dan Rivera, former Army veteran, paranormal investigator, lead figure in Nesper. He carried the doll, explained the history, managed the narrative for audiences who wanted to see danger, but not too close. He became part of the legend, not just caretaker, but character. His TikToks brought Annabelle into thousands of timelines. His voice told the story over and over until it felt like liturgy. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Because the line between folklore and tragedy blurred on July 13th, 2025, in a hotel room in Gettysburg, where Dan Rivera was found unresponsive. The doll was not in the room. Officials insisted there was nothing suspicious. Natural causes, they said. But online, the narrative wrote itself before the coroner could sharpen a pencil. And just like that, Annabelle had a new chapter, one that no glass case could contain. Gettysburg is already heavy. You don't need to be psychic to feel it. The fields hold more than corn and grass. They hold echoes, the kind of silence that hums, the kind of stillness that remembers. So, when the Devils on the Run tour rolled in July 2025, carrying its boxes of haunted memorabilia, the atmosphere was already loaded. Add Annabelle to that mix, a doll in a glass case, a magnet for every superstition, and you could practically feel the internet typing before anything even happened. Dan Rivera was the face of that tour. Veteran, investigator, steady voice on TikTok explaining why this glass box was a threshold you shouldn't test. He carried the weight of Nesper on his shoulders. An heir of sorts to the Warrens, even if he never pretended to be their clone. Audiences liked him because he didn't condescend. He didn't laugh off belief, but he also didn't milk it with theatrics. Rivera treated haunted objects the way a bomb squad treats an old grenade, with calm, ritual, and respect. On July 13th, 2025, he didn't make it to the next show. Hotel staff in Gettysburg found him unresponsive in his room. 45 years old, strong, disciplined, gone. The news hit like a thunderclap across the paranormal community. Headlines arrived fast, clinical. Paranormal investigator found dead. Then came the qualifiers. Natural causes suspected. No foul play. Words meant to calm, but online they worked like lighter fluid. Because here's the thing. When a man spends his final weeks touring with the most infamous, haunted doll in America, the narrative writes itself. The hashtag practically trends on autopilot. Within hours, Twitter threads proclaimed Annabelle had claimed another victim. TikTok edits spliced Rivera's last videos with ominous captions and slowed down music. Conspiracy forums dissected every timeline detail. What time had he been seen last? Was there a 911 call? Was Annabelle nearby? Nespa scrambled to clarify. No, the doll was not in Rivera's room. She was locked, as always, in a cabinet. Security footage confirmed it. Officials repeated that the death appeared natural. Gettysburg police denied rumors of a scene disturbed or evidence hidden. But online truth doesn't bow to official statements. Online truth feeds on what feels too neat, too tidy. And Rivera's death felt anything but tidy. Some pointed to the irony. This was the man who had just weeks earlier reassured crowds that Annabelle's power was real but contained. That respect kept boundaries intact. Others seized on the timing. Gettysburg, a hotspot for paranormal tourism, paired with the doll's notoriety. Some claimed equipment had malfunctioned during the show the night before. That Rivera had seemed drained. Whether or not any of it was factual didn't matter. What mattered was that grief and myth collided in real time, and a man's death became fodder for a doll's legend. This is the cruel gravity of folklore. It doesn't wait for autopsy reports. It doesn't pause for families. It eats the moment whole and spits out meaning. Rivera became the latest entry in a long line of alleged victims. Priests, bikers, skeptics. Except this time, people could name him, watch his videos, scroll his feed. He wasn't anonymous. He wasn't a cautionary tale recycled from a tour guide's lips. He was real, recent, and painfully visible. In the days that followed, tributes and theories tangled. Colleagues described Rivera as dedicated, warm, someone who believed in educating rather than exploiting. Friends called him protective, devoted to his family. Fans lit virtual candles in comment sections. And alongside those voices came the whispers, Annabelle took him. He mocked her once. Did you see that clip? The doll always gets the last word. Did he mock her? Maybe once with a half joke meant to break the tension. Did he believe she was dangerous? Absolutely. He said so many times. But belief and respect aren't guarantees of safety, and in the absence of clarity, the void fills with story. Meanwhile, authorities tried to control the narrative with facts. No signs of trauma, no evidence of foul play, a medical examination pending. Statements delivered in the cool tones of professionalism. But folklore doesn't obey lab results. Folklore asks, why now? Why here? Why him? And when there's no answer, it writes its own. Gettysburg, already a town built on blood and legend, became the perfect stage for the next chapter of Annabelle's myth. A place where the air is heavy, where soldiers' names are carved into stone, now carrying whispers of a doll's reach. Rivera's death stitched itself seamlessly into the ongoing tapestry of rumor, fact, faith, and fear. And the doll, she stayed behind glass, silent, motionless, letting the world do the moving for her. When the news of Dan Rivera's death hit the feeds, it didn't just ripple, it detonated. Grief and speculation arrived side by side, tangled like vines that refused to grow separately. And in that tangle, rumors sprouted at an alarming pace, specific, colourful, impossible to verify, and all the more potent because of it. The first theory to surface was the most obvious, the one almost everyone expected. Annabelle got him. The phrasing varied, sometimes blunt, sometimes dressed in nervous humour. But the gist was always the same. Rivera had been her caretaker, her handler, her public escort on the Devil's on the Run tour. In folklore logic, that proximity is enough. You spend your days near the fire. Eventually you get burned. TikTok was filled with clips of him standing beside the case, explaining the Warrens' warnings, slowed down and captioned with eerie music. He didn't listen. Now she's free. Another thread twisted in quickly. The doll was in the room. Official reports said otherwise, but screenshots claiming to show leaked hotel photos began to circulate. Grainy, blurred images of a cabinet in a corner. Never sourced, always recycled. Some insisted staff had moved Annabelle into Rivera's suite for safekeeping. Others swore they heard from a friend of a friend that he broke the rule, that he opened the case just to prove it was harmless. Nothing verifiable. But rumor doesn't need clarity, it thrives in the fog. Then came the darker theory. Annabelle doesn't need to move to kill. The idea spread that Rivera's death proved the doll's influence was psychic, not physical. Hashtags like Annabelle curse and she never left racked up millions of views. Young creators whispered into their front-facing cameras, what if the case was never enough? What if she never needed to leave the box? A clip of Rivera explaining boundaries was remixed into a sinister edit. She's contained. Cut. She's not. Conspiracies didn't stop at the doll. Some speculated that Rivera had been silenced. That Nesper knew too much. That Gettysburg police were covering up evidence of something supernatural they couldn't admit. A fringe narrative even claimed Rivera had uncovered proof that Annabelle was not haunted by a demon, but by multiple entities, and that he died before he could share it. Was there evidence? Of course not. But YouTube thumbnails screamed exposed anyway, complete with red arrows pointing at nothing in particular. Meanwhile, old legends resurfaced like corpses floating back up from a riverbed. The tale of the motorcyclist who mocked Annabelle and allegedly crashed to his death reappeared on every forum, pasted next to Rivera's obituary as if folklore and reality belonged in the same news cycle. Some insisted he was simply the latest in a long pattern. Skeptics, priests, caretakers, all mysteriously punished after disrespecting the doll. The chain of supposed victims lengthened with every retelling. And then came the escape theory. It wasn't new. The doll had escaped once before in 2020, when a mistranslated article about actress Annabelle Wallis went viral, and the internet convinced itself the glass case was empty. But in the wake of Rivera's death, the rumor took on new life. She's gone. That's why he died. TikTok edits showed empty chairs, open doors, grainy corridors, none of which had anything to do with Monroe or Gettysburg, but context barely matters when fear is doing the heavy lifting. Even reputable news outlets were forced to publish clarifications. No, Annabelle had not escaped. Yes, she was still in her case. The myth was louder than the facts. A subgenre of rumor focused on Rivera's own demeanor in his final weeks. Commenters dissected his last TikToks, searching for signs. Look how tired he looks here. Listen, he slips. He says she instead of the doll. Some even claimed he blinked oddly, that his eyes looked glazed, that he was being drained. Never mind that anyone running a traveling paranormal roadshow while filming, editing, and performing for audiences might look exhausted. Paranormal folklore doesn't care about practical explanations. It cares about patterns, and the more ominous the better. Theories sprouted about the number 13, because of course they did. Rivera's death on July 13th, in a haunted town tied to America's bloodiest battle? Coincidence? Or numerology with teeth? Reddit threads linked it to anniversaries of previous Annabelle incidents. Timelines bent and stitched together until they looked deliberate. And yet, underneath the noise, something more human pulsed. The need to make sense of loss. Rivera was respected, even loved. His sudden absence left a hole, and into that hole people poured meaning. For some, Annabelle was to blame. For others, it was proof of cosmic rules we don't understand. For skeptics, it was simply another example of the internet feeding grief into the meme machine. But either way, the legend fattened. The doll's aura grew, and the cabinet in Monroe, or on the road, depending on who you believed, became heavier with every retelling. The cruelest irony? Through all of this, Annabelle remained perfectly still. She didn't twitch, didn't tilt her head, didn't scrawl a new note in childish handwriting. She let people do the moving, the fearing, the storytelling. Because folklore doesn't need its subject to act. Folklore just needs an object, and a crowd willing to tell each other why it matters. By the end of July 2025, you couldn't scroll for 5 minutes without seeing her face. Yarn hair, stitched grin, flanked by captions warning you not to mock her, daring you to share. Theories had crystallized into their own ecosystem. She killed him directly. The curse of disrespect. She killed him indirectly, draining his life, marking him as her keeper. She didn't kill him at all, but his death was absorbed into her myth, which is almost worse. She escaped. And if so, where was she now? Annabelle, silent in her box, had never been more alive. There's always that moment in stories like this where someone leans in with a smug grin and says, well, actually, they want to sweep everything off the table, knock over the glass case, and declare it all smoke and mirrors. But life and legend are rarely that simple. Between provable fact and wild rumor sits a wide grey space, the territory where belief, intuition, and things we can't quite measure do their work. So let's walk carefully. No scalpels, no sledgehammers, just a slow peeling back of layers to see what is documented, what is fabricated, and what remains unresolved. Fact. Annabelle is real. She's not porcelain like in the movies, but a cloth Raggedy Ann doll given to Donna in 1970. This isn't speculation, is on record. Corroborated by multiple witnesses, photographed, displayed. No one argues her physical existence. Fact. Strange things were reported in that Hartford apartment. Movement without explanation. Notes appearing on paper that didn't belong to the women. Lou's story of waking to scratches on his torso. Are these events captured on video? Number. They are testimonies. Human voices describing what they lived. For skeptics, that's too soft. For believers, that's exactly how most real hauntings come to us. Not as crisp evidence, but as lived experience. Myth. That Annabelle is possessed by the ghost of a 7-year-old girl named Annabelle Higgins. The Warrens disputed that interpretation themselves, insisting what masqueraded as innocence was something inhuman, something darker. Whether you trust the medium's first reading or the Warrens' later judgment depends on your worldview. But the little girl's ghost explanation became sticky folklore, retold because it feels relatable. Fact, the Warrens did remove the doll and place her in a glass cabinet, where she has remained for decades. Visitors to the occult museum confirm it. The sign, "Positively do not open," still hangs there, stern as ever. The case is real. The warning's real. Myth. That dozens of documented deaths are directly linked to mocking the doll. The infamous motorcyclist who laughed, then crashed, is repeated endlessly, but never tied to a verifiable police record. Same with the priest who supposedly taunted her before a near-fatal car accident. Could these events have happened in some form? Possibly. But as far as hard evidence goes, they live mostly in retellings. Fact: Annabelle has become a cultural icon, largely because of the Warrens' storytelling. Gerald Brittle's 1980 book, The Demonologist, and later, Hollywood's Conjuring franchise. The Porcelain Hollywood version is myth. The soft, unimpressive Raggedy Ann is fact. Myth. That Annabelle escaped in 2020. The internet convinced itself she'd vanished after a mistranslated article about actress Annabelle Wallis. Nesper had to issue a statement confirming she hadn't moved an inch. Proof? Photos of her still sitting behind glass. Escape panic. Entirely internet-born. Fact: Dan Rivera, a real investigator, a real veteran, really died on July 13th, 2025, in Gettysburg during the Devils on the Run tour. Authorities called it natural causes. He was only 45. He was healthy, beloved, respected. That makes his death shocking. And shock invites folklore like open doors invite drafts. Myth and belief that Annabelle killed Rivera. No autopsy has declared anything of the sort. Police found nothing suspicious. But folklore doesn't operate on coroner's language. To many, the timing is too uncanny. A man who spent months escorting the doll suddenly gone in a haunted town on the 13th. It feels like more than coincidence. For some, that feeling is its own kind of truth. Here's the tension. Facts alone do not satisfy. People don't sit around campfires for police reports. They sit for stories. And the doll has become the perfect canvas. A vessel not just for spirits, but for meaning, for our need to explain tragedy, our hunger for symbols that embody the thin line between the seen and unseen. Skeptics will say, there's nothing to it. A doll is a doll. Believers will say, objects can carry energy. Some things do not move, yet still move us. Both can hold truth at once. Because whether Annabelle is literally haunted, or whether she's the stage on which our fears perform, she works. People feel something in her presence. Visitors describe the room going still. They walk away changed, quieter. That reaction itself is real, even if science hasn't named its mechanism. Myth versus fact, then, isn't a clean boxing match. It's a dance. The facts pin the story to the floor so it doesn't float away. The myths give it wings so it can travel from Hartford to Hollywood, to TikTok and back again. And in between lies that foggy space, the realm of spirit, intuition, energy, where not everything can be measured, but much can be felt. Annabelle sits in her case, still as fabric, while the world around her spins rumors, theories, and fears into gold. That, too, is a kind of haunting. You could line up 100 haunted houses, 100 cursed objects, and still, if you put a doll among them, that's the one people won't look away from. There's something about dolls. Always has been. Always will be. Psychologists have a word they like to drag out for this. The uncanny valley. That uneasy shiver when something looks almost human, but not quite. A face that smiles but never blinks. Eyes that shine but don't move with light. Dolls sit perfectly in that gap. They're meant to comfort, to mimic innocence, to give children a proxy for care. But for adults, that mimicry tips into menace. They look human enough to suggest life, but too lifeless to relax us. They're like masks that never take themselves off. Cultures have known this forever. In some traditions, dolls were made not as toys, but as vessels for ancestors, for protective spirits, for things you didn't want wandering loose. In Japan, the Hina dolls are displayed once a year and then carefully packed away, never left out too long, as if exposure changes their character. In parts of Africa and the Caribbean, dolls were carved with deliberate intention, a form of sympathetic magic. You treat the doll as if it is a person, because in some way, it is. So when Annabelle's story hit the modern bloodstream, the stage was already set. She wasn't just a haunted thing, she was a haunted doll. That combination digs straight into the cultural marrow. Even people who roll their eyes at ghosts still flinch at the idea of a toy shifting when no one's looking. Children's objects gone wrong always feel worse because they flip comfort into danger. And then there's the fact that Annabelle isn't beautiful. She isn't porcelain, delicate, gilded like a Victorian keepsake. She's soft, raggedy, almost ridiculous, which makes her scarier. Horror works best when it invades the ordinary. A coffin-shaped relic already looks like trouble. You're ready for it. But a floppy cloth doll, that's supposed to be harmless. That's supposed to be safety. When safety itself feels tainted, that's when people get truly unsettled. Hollywood understood this instinctively, even as it betrayed the facts. They gave us a porcelain Annabelle with cracked cheeks and sinister posture because cameras love sharp lines. But the truth, the cloth face, the stitched grin, hits deeper once you know the story. It whispers, if even this can be dangerous, nothing is safe. But here's the other reason Annabelle endures. She's portable. Unlike a haunted castle or a battlefield, she's an object. She can be moved, displayed, toured. She can sit in a case and let people bring their fear to her. She doesn't require a pilgrimage to Europe or an old ruin in the woods. She lives in a box in Connecticut, or, for a while, on the road across America. And that accessibility makes her legend viral. She's a ghost story you can buy a ticket to see. And the internet? Oh, the internet was made for Annabelle. She photographs well, not in beauty, but in eeriness. You look at that stitched smile and immediately know there's a story. She's mimetic. Instantly recognizable, instantly unsettling. You don't need a paragraph of context. Just a single frame and the words, "Do not open," and you're hooked. Believers, skeptics, casual fans, all of them feed the legend because dolls live in that sweet spot where no one feels neutral. You love them or you hate them. You cuddle them or you shudder. And folklore thrives on polarity. The more people argue, the stronger the story grows. And let's not forget the spiritual layer, the part that goes beyond psychology. If you believe objects can carry energy, then a doll is practically designed for it. It has eyes, a face, a body. It's a vessel by nature. People direct their emotions toward it. Comfort, fear, mockery, reverence. Every one of those emotions leaves a trace. Over 50 years, that's a mountain of energy pressed into one stuffed figure. Whether or not a spirit lives inside Annabelle, the psychic weight around her is undeniable. Step into her room, and you're stepping into half a century of projection, belief, and raw, unfiltered fear. So why does Annabelle endure while other haunted objects gather dust? Because she's perfect folklore fuel. She's a doll, which taps an ancient instinct. She's ordinary, which makes her violation of safety sting harder. She's accessible, seen by thousands, argued over by millions, and she's charged spiritually and culturally by decades of attention. Every scream in a theatre, every TikTok edit, every whispered Don't mess with her adds another layer. Even silence adds weight, because silence in front of Annabelle isn't absence. It's acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, over time, builds gravity. Which is why, more than 50 years after Donna first set her on a bed in Hartford, Annabelle still sits behind glass and manages to feel larger than life. A small doll in a wooden cabinet, and yet, somehow, one of the loudest figures in modern folklore. Because dolls don't have to move, they just have to watch. Panic has always been contagious. A single scream in a crowd and suddenly everyone's running, whether they saw the threat or not. But in the 21st century, we built an amplifier for that instinct. We call it the internet. Annabelle was practically engineered for virality, even if she never twitched a finger. She's got the visuals, soft body, button eyes, the handmade sign declaring, "Positively do not open." That photograph alone is clickbait in raw form. Add the backstory, scratches, priests, car crashes, and suddenly you've got something the internet eats for breakfast. A meme that doubles as a dare. The clearest example? August 2020. Out of nowhere, number Annabelle trended worldwide because a Chinese news article about actress Annabelle Wallis got mistranslated. A few clicks later, people were posting, "The haunted doll has escaped." No photos, no evidence, just a mistranslation snowballing into global folklore in under 12 hours. TikTok filled with shaky videos of empty bedrooms captioned, "She's coming." Twitter piled on with jokes, then with serious warnings. Nespa had to step in with an official statement. She has not escaped. She's in her case. Proof? They posted new photos. Did that kill the rumor? Of course not. Once a story catches fire online, facts just look like weak buckets of water against a burning house. That's the psychology of digital panic. People don't spread what's true. They spread what vibrates. And Annabelle's escaped vibrates with every primal instinct we've got. Fear of dolls, fear of the unseen, fear of what might walk into your room when the lights are out. When Dan Rivera died in Gettysburg, the machine revved into overdrive. Hashtags like #Annabelle curse, #do not open, she got him flooded feeds. TikTok edits paired Rivera's own videos with eerie filters and captions. He tried to warn us. Reddit built timelines, mapping Rivera's final hours as though solving a mystery, pulling together hotel rumors, supposed eyewitness posts, even fabricated 911 transcripts. Screenshots spread of an empty case that was really just a museum photo taken after hours. But once the caption says, "She's gone," people see absence where there's simply shadow. Why does this work so well? Because panic is thrilling when you're safe at home. People want to be spooked. They want the adrenaline spike of thinking something uncanny is loose in the world. The doll becomes a safe lightning rod. You can tweet, "Annabelle's escaped, lock your doors," while knowing the worst you'll face is a stuffed toy in Connecticut. It's danger without consequence, horror packaged for your phone screen. And yet, beneath the joking tone, there's sincerity. Many people don't laugh when they say, "Don't mock her." They mean it. They believe objects can carry energy, that some things are better left unprovoked. You can see it in the comments. Teenagers half laughing but still refusing to look too long at a photo before bed. Parents shaking their heads and saying, "Don't bring that energy into the house." Belief coexists with irony, and together they make a legend indestructible. Think about it. We've had haunted objects for centuries. Cursed jewels, bleeding statues, books bound in strange leather. Most of them live in old folklore archives. But Annabelle? She's digital. Her story was uploaded and replicated, spliced into memes and conspiracy threads. She isn't just in Monroe anymore. She's everywhere, every time someone presses share. That's the paradox of panic online. We say we're afraid, but secretly, we want to feed the fear. It makes us feel connected. It makes us feel alive. And in the case of Annabelle, it makes a cloth doll heavier than lead in the cultural imagination. So when you scroll past another headline, Annabelle spotted in Walmart at 3 a.m., you laugh, maybe. You roll your eyes, maybe. But you still stop. You still look. And for that moment, the panic machine hums along, powered not by the doll, but by you. Annabelle doesn't have to escape. We let her out every time we hit share. There's a reason cultures across the world have treated objects as more than decoration. A carved statue, a lock of hair, a piece of jewelry worn too long. Things collect more than dust. They collect presence. And if you've ever walked into a room and felt something before you saw it, you already know what I mean. Annabelle is a textbook example of this principle. To skeptics, she's a rag doll with a stitched smile. To believers, she's not just cotton and yarn. She's a vessel. 50 years of attention, fear, reverence, anger, prayer, and mockery poured into her like water into clay. Objects, remember. Not in the way a hard drive does, but in the way energy lingers. Think of it this way. Every emotion leaves a fingerprint. When a child hugs a toy for comfort, that imprint stays. When someone fears an object, that fear becomes another layer. Over decades, with millions of eyes watching, with millions of people projecting belief into a single doll, the weight becomes palpable. Step into the Warren Museum or the tour exhibit, and you feel it before you even read the sign. The atmosphere changes. It's not the glass, it's not the wood, it's the accumulation of meaning. Spiritual traditions have words for this. Catholics call certain items relics. Shamans speak of power objects. In Hoodoo, there are conjure dolls. In Buddhism, objects are blessed to hold and radiate intention. None of this is new. Human beings instinctively treat some objects as if they're alive, because energetically they are. So when people say Annabelle is just a doll, they're technically right, on the surface. But what sits in that case is not only cloth, it's history, it's attention, it's 50 years of fear whispered into her button eyes. Whether you believe in demons or not, energy doesn't just evaporate. It hangs, it builds, it clings. And objects, especially those shaped like us, make perfect vessels. That's why the Warrens took no chances. They never destroyed Annabelle, because destroying an object doesn't necessarily release what's inside. It can scatter it. They chose containment instead. The glass case wasn't theatrics. It was a boundary, a fence built out of respect for the unseen. A way of saying, you may exist, but you don't get to wander. And believers who visit the doll, many of them don't mock. They pray, they cross themselves, they speak softly as if in church. Because somewhere deep down, we understand that objects can be more than things. They can be thresholds, they can be mirrors, they can be keepers of energies we don't have names for yet. Even skeptics, if you watch closely, rarely press their forehead against the glass for long. They joke, they pose for a selfie, but there's always that little pause, that instinct that says, what if? Call it survival instinct, call it respect, but it's there. And it's why Annabelle continues to hold people in her orbit. The truth is, whether or not a literal inhuman spirit dwells inside her, the doll is already charged. She is living folklore. She is psychic gravity. the moment you think about her. The moment you feel that twinge of unease in your stomach, she's doing her work. Not because she moves, but because she doesn't have to. So yes, there is more here than stitches and yarn, more than photographs or headlines. Annabelle is proof that belief itself has weight. Proof that attention itself can conjure. Proof that some objects, through mystery or memory, become more alive than the people who own them. And she sits, waiting, watching, while the world continues to pour itself into her. If Annabelle had stayed in Donna's apartment in 1970, she would have been a footnote. A weird story told over wine, maybe a local legend whispered at college parties. Hey, remember those nurses with the haunted doll? And then it would fade, the way most hauntings fade, into silence and dust. But she didn't fade. She multiplied. The Warrens made sure of that. Say what you want about their methods. Too theatrical, too devout, too invested in proving their worldview. But Ed and Lorraine had one skill no one can deny. They knew how to frame a story. They took Annabelle out of an apartment and put her into a glass cabinet, not just for safety, but for narrative. They made her a chapter in their book, The Demonologist, turning her from that creepy doll into Exhibit A of inhuman manipulation. And then they let the public come see her. A pilgrimage site was born. Folklore loves a stage. And the museum, however cramped, however unassuming, became exactly that. People stood in front of the case and whispered their own versions of the legend, layering rumor on top of rumor. One priest's near miss on the highway became 3. One motorcyclist's accident became dozens. The stories grew, as stories always do when they're retold in hushed tones. Hollywood took it from there. The Conjuring, 2013, didn't just tell a ghost story, it rebranded one. Suddenly Annabelle wasn't just a rag doll in a Connecticut basement. She was the opening act of a global horror franchise. And here's the twist. The porcelain monster Wan's team dreamed up looks nothing like the original. But the movies made the real doll more famous anyway. Because audiences love contrast. They Google real Annabelle after the credits roll and shudder at how ordinary she looks. That shudder, the gap between fiction and fact, is exactly where folklore thrives. By the time TikTok got hold of her, Annabelle was no longer just an artifact. She was a digital entity, a meme, a recurring character in the theatre of the internet. When people say she escaped or she got him, they're not just spreading rumors, they're participating in folklore in real time. They're storytellers in a chain that stretches back centuries, from campfire tales to Instagram reels, and that's her true legacy. Annabelle is a modern myth, built from equal parts fact, fear, faith, and internet panic. Unlike Dracula or Frankenstein, she isn't fiction. Unlike Bigfoot, she isn't a blurry figure in the woods. She's real, tangible, locked in a cabinet. That physicality anchors the story. You can visit her. You can take a selfie. You can argue about her online at 3 a.m. while her stitched grin stares back at you from a thumbnail. Some will say it's all nonsense. That's fine. Folklore doesn't require belief from everyone. It just requires enough people to keep talking. And Annabelle has more than enough talk. Every death rumor, every TikTok edit, every headline with her name in it feeds the legend. Every skeptic who scoffs makes believers double down. Every believer who whispers, "Don't mock her," makes skeptics roll their eyes. And the cycle continues. 50 years on, Annabelle is no longer just a doll. She's a cultural litmus test. She tells us who we are when we face the unknown. Are we the type to laugh? to pray, to share, to research. Whatever your answer, you've already joined the story. You've already added a thread to the tapestry. And that tapestry isn't going anywhere. Even if tomorrow the museum locked its doors forever, even if the doll disappeared from sight, the legend is too big to cage now. Annabelle has crossed over, not just as a haunted object, but as permanent folklore. She lives in books, in movies, in memes, in whispers, in nightmares. The rag doll in a wooden box became something larger than herself, and in that transformation lies her true power. She doesn't need to move. We move for her. We carry her in our stories, our fears, our jokes, our late night scrolls. That is Annabelle's legacy, not stitches and stuffing, but survival. Annabelle isn't alone. Haunted dolls are practically a subgenre of folklore, spread across cultures like echoes of the same dream. If you zoom out, she becomes less of an anomaly and more of a chapter in a much older story. Humanity's long suspicion that dolls are never just dolls. Take Robert the doll in Key West, Florida. Older than Annabelle by decades, Robert belonged to a boy named Eugene Otto around the turn of the 20th century. The doll is almost human-sized, dressed in a sailor's outfit, with button eyes and a faintly judgmental expression. Legend says Eugene blamed Robert for all sorts of childhood chaos. Broken objects, tantrums, whispers in the night. As an adult, he kept the doll in a window where neighbors swore they saw it move. Visitors to the museum where Robert now sits claim their cameras glitch, their moods sour, their trips collapse into accidents if they fail to ask permission. Before snapping a photo, letters of apology arrive at the museum every year, addressed to a doll in a glass case. Sound familiar? Then there's Okiku, a Japanese doll enshrined in Manji Temple in Hokkaido. Gifted to a young girl in 1918, the doll supposedly became a vessel for her spirit after she died. Over the decades, the doll's black hair has grown, not metaphorically but literally, according to temple caretakers who trim it regularly. Scientists may argue about keratin and environmental conditions, but for believers, Okiku's ever-lengthening hair is proof that she houses more than cotton. Like Annabelle, Okiku is both ordinary and extraordinary. A toy elevated to vessel, a vessel elevated to legend. Different continents, different stories, but the same pattern repeats. Dolls are built to mirror us, and in that mirroring, we project into them love, grief, play, fear. They become containers for our emotions, and sometimes for something more. Annabelle's uniqueness lies not in being haunted, but in being modern haunted. Robert's story is carried by postcards and whispered tours, Okiku's by temple rituals and oral history. Annabelle? She lives in hashtags, movie theaters, YouTube essays. She's the first haunted doll to go viral on a global scale, her legend accelerated by the internet's endless appetite. That's what separates her. She's not just folklore, she's pop culture, folklore, and meme culture all welded into one. And here's the twist. Once you know about Robert and Okiku, Annabelle doesn't look like a freak accident. She looks like part of a pattern, a lineage, proof that across oceans and centuries, people have looked into a doll's eyes and felt something look back. For believers, that's validation. Haunted dolls exist everywhere, so Annabelle is no less real than her siblings. For skeptics, it's anthropology. Humans everywhere distrust the human-shaped when it's not alive. But either way, the conclusion is the same. Annabelle didn't invent her power. She inherited it. And in her stitched grin, you can see the echoes of every story ever told about a toy that learned to listen. Which brings us back to her case in Connecticut. or her traveling cabinet on tour. Annabelle sits there, still as cloth, while the weight of her haunted family tree presses behind her. She doesn't need to move. Robert didn't. Okiku doesn't. The movement happens in us. Because when enough people across enough centuries whisper the same fear into the same kind of object, maybe it stops being superstition and starts being something else. No museum label ever tells the whole story. The plaque gives you the headline. The room holds the footnotes. With Annabelle, the footnotes talk. They belong to caretakers and clerics, tourists and techs, people who rolled their eyes and people who crossed themselves. Some accounts are crisp, some are smudged by time, and a few are stitched so tightly to the myth that you can't tell where memory ends and retelling begins. But taken together, they're the living margin notes of a legend. Start with the apartment, before the case and the sign. The version Donna told the Warrens never stopped evolving in the retelling, because that's what stories do when they're touched by fear. But certain details stayed nailed down. The notes. Help us. Help Lou. Paper that didn't belong to the apartment. Graphite that didn't match the pencils they owned. Lou's old hag moment on the sofa. Pressure on the chest. Air stolen at the edge of waking. And the 3 shallow scratches that faded in under 48 hours. He never made himself a martyr. He hated the attention. He spoke of it like a man irritated by a mosquito bite that somehow knew his name. Then the cleric. The Warrens would tell it with the kind of gravity that doesn't need a spotlight. A young priest, half skeptic, half curious, visiting the museum on a day when the air smelled like old varnish and wax. He tapped the glass with a fingernail and said something a little too clever, the way young men do when they're trying to convince themselves they're not impressed. On the drive home, his car swerved. Blown tire, slick patch, angel's nudge, pick your path through the story. And he arrived rattled, not ruined. He called the Warrens from the directory phone and said the thing people say when symbols argue back. I shouldn't have. Whether you file that under coincidence or consequence depends on the folder system you live by. The fact that he phoned at all is the detail that matters. There's the honeymoon couple who detoured through Monroe because why not begin marriage by staring at a boundary you're not supposed to cross? He mocked out loud. She whispered a prayer under her breath, so softly that he didn't hear it until she repeated it later, when the camera they brought down from the car refused to keep a charge within 10 feet of the case, but happily recorded a grainy hour of parking lot gravel. At home, the photos were there and not there, thumbnails corrupt, file names alive with question marks. They mailed a letter months later, not an apology exactly, more like a nod to the strangeness. We don't know what happened, but something did. We're fine. We're not laughing as much. The museum kept a drawer for notes like that because drawers are where you put things that don't fit in display cases. Ask the volunteers about cold spots. They'll show you the map of drafts in that room, the way winter snakes under the door and summer leans through the window. And then they'll tell you about the patch of air that doesn't care what season it is. A coin-sized chill just to the left of the cabinet, the kind you only notice when you pause long enough to name it. One attendant watched people step into it involuntarily, blink, and step back out as if a cat had brushed their ankle. No theatrics, no screams, just that small, human flinch that says the body has registered something the brain hasn't caught up to yet. Television brought its own liturgy. Crews arrived with cases of lights, and the smugness of people who can burrow inside a building's bones with lenses. Batteries drained faster near the case, which every skeptic will tell you is both common and meaningless. And yet, when your third pack dips to red in 10 minutes and your audio picks up a radio station you can't tune out, meaning changes shape. One sound engineer, a tattoo of St. Michael peeking from his sleeve, refused to lay a lav mic on the cabinet's wood. Wire or no wire, he said. I'm not pinning anything to her. Nobody on set laughed. Then there's the brusque guy, every legend needs one, who rapped his knuckles on the glass during a ticketed tour stop and said, "If you're so tough, say something." He got an answer he didn't want from the living. The caretaker escorted him out and kept the rest of the room calm with the kind of patient seriousness you use around lit candles. Later, the man posted that his day went sideways. A fight with a friend, a missed train, a splitting headache that ached behind one eye like a slow weather front. Is that a curse? Maybe it's just how days go. Maybe it's how days go when you knock on doors that ask you not to. Not all accounts are grim. A woman came in with a small stack of prayer cards and a face marked by the sort of grief that sits deeper than tears. She didn't speak to the doll. She spoke to the room. She thanked the guardians for doing the work that lets other people sleep. She stood beside the case and breathed as if she were filling a well. Later, she told an attendant that a particular heaviness she'd carried since her sister's death felt returned to the ground. Like handing a weight to someone stronger, she said, and left a single white carnation under the sign. The blossom was removed, because rules are rules, but for an hour the cabinet looked less like a boundary and more like an altar. Family notes surfaced quietly. A caretaker who grew up in the orbit of this collection says the same line every few years, when interviews ask the same questions. The case is for us, not for her. He means it both ways. The glass spares the curious from their own curiosity. It also spares the object from being turned into a prop in 1,000 grasping hands. Containment is respect. Respect is containment. The older he gets, the less he argues the point. If you don't understand, I can't make you, he says. If you do, I don't have to. The travelling exhibit added fresh notes to the file. Road crews learned the choreography, set the case, check the latches, mind the line. Before doors opened, someone always blessed the room, sometimes with holy water, sometimes with a whispered intention, sometimes with a palm resting briefly on the wood like a handshake. If you think ritual is superstition, fine. If you know ritual is architecture for the unseen, you'll recognize the gesture. On a Friday in a city where the hotel carpet smelled like new plastic, the house lights dimmed, and a murmur passed through the audience that wasn't fear so much as readiness. And that is when a rumor is born most easily, when the crowd leans forward together and the story feels like it might lean back. A more granular footnote. People cry. Not often, not dramatically, but it happens. The silent kind, where a single tear takes the long road down a cheek, while the rest of the face holds steady. Ask why, and they'll shrug. It's a lot, they'll say. The way you do when your vocabulary can't keep pace with your nervous system. One man whispered that it reminded him of a toy his sister loved. She died when they were children. Another said it felt like looking at something that had listened to too many nightmares and was full of them now. Neither of those are data points. They're the kind of truths without clipboards that build folklore from the inside out. There are records, of course. Police reports from the old apartment, scribbled timelines, a scuffed cassette with a hissy interview, photographs that look like nothing until they become evidence for someone who needs them to be. And there are also the stories that never touch paper, because not everything that matters wants to be notarized. A volunteer's dream where the doll finally blinked, and it wasn't sinister. It was simply tired. A janitor who leaves the overheads off in that room at closing and works with a lamp because the glare on the glass feels disrespectful. A security guard who hums under his breath when his route passes the case and swears the shift goes better when he does. If you want a conclusion, there isn't one. There's only accumulation. The apartment story, the priest's phone call, the honeymoon camera, the cold patch of air and the drained batteries and the small acts of reverence and the foolish acts of bravado. The tour, the rules, the blessings, the tears people don't expect to shed. Put them all together and you don't get proof. You get presence. A pressure in the narrative, a density. The sense that an object shaped like a person has been treated like a person for so long that the treatment itself became a kind of life. And through it all, the doll sits, cloth and yarn, and the kind of stitched smile that refuses to telegraph intention. Maybe that's the point. She doesn't announce, she receives, the case keeps hands away, but it can't keep meaning out. Meaning passes through glass as easily as light, which is why these field notes matter. Not to convince the unconvinced, but to keep each other honest about what people actually feel in that room. A museum label says artifact, the room says threshold. The visitors, in all their skeptical reverence and believing doubt, say something happened to me here. That sentence won't make it into a ledger. It will make it into a legend. And for an object whose power is the story we carry away, that's the only ledger that counts. Annabelle never had to stand, never had to speak. She simply sat, and the world wrote the rest for her. From a Hartford apartment to a glass case in Monroe, from whispered rumors to Hollywood blockbusters, from the Warrens' voices to TikTok hashtags, she became more than fabric. She became a mirror, reflecting our fears, our beliefs, our hunger for stories that reach beyond the visible. Dan Rivera's death folded her into a darker chapter, not because there was proof, but because folklore doesn't wait for proof. Every retelling, every headline, every late-night scroll keeps her alive. And maybe that's the point. The doll doesn't move. We do. And as long as we move her story forward, Annabelle never really stops. So, what do you think? Is Annabelle just a stuffed toy with a stitched smile? Or is she something heavier, charged with decades of fear and attention? Drop your take in the comments. I want to know if you'd step into that room and face her glass case, or if you'd keep a very respectful distance. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest legends of our time, make sure you hit like, tap subscribe, and keep the bell on so you don't miss the next story. And if you'd like to support the channel and help me keep digging into tales that blur the line between myth and reality, you can always do that at ko-fi.com/Napmax. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, sometimes for bedtime, sometimes for broad daylight. Thanks for listening. Now, go double check that your toys are still where you left them.